In this series of videos, I'm going to demonstrate a hash map and compare it to an array list. I know that's going to be a fairly long topic, so I'm breaking it into two parts. This video is not going to talk at all about the hash map, but I'm going to get our existing driver program ready for the hash map. Here's what I'm going to do. We have our existing Swing graphical user interface like so, and I want this to interact with our existing inventory reader class, which simply opens up a file with car data in it and reads those into an array list. So eventually I'm going to replace that with a hash map in the next video. But first I want our Swing form to interact with this. So a couple things I'm going to do. From the Swing form, I'm going to invoke this createVehicle method. Secondly, in the Swing form itself, I'm going to add a VIN lookup at the top. So we need to add vehicle identification number, or VIN, to our vehicles. So I'm going to add a VIN lookup component to the top with like a search button on it, and that will allow us to find a vehicle that was read in from this text file. Now, if we're going to add vehicle identification number to vehicles, then I also need to add a VIN attribute to the vehicle class plus getters and setters. So let's start with that, and there's naturally a bit of work that I need to do to get this all ready. So let's start by adding our VIN. And now we have both our VIN and getters and setters. So let's go to our form and add that lookup. So you notice that now I have VIN at the top plus the search button. So what I need to do now is when the user presses search, I needed to go against that inventory reader class, look at the collection, which will eventually put a hash map in, and find the vehicle that has that matching VIN. So I'll need to set up an action listener on this search button. Note that I can get whatever the user typed in by entering txt_VIN, which is that text field for the vehicle identification number, and then get text, and we'll assign this to a local variable. Now, we're able to get that information, but we still haven't hooked up our form to the inventory reader. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm going to need to invoke some methods that don't yet exist. So I'm going to stub those out in this video. And then in the next video, when we actually have the hash map, I can add that implementation. But just want to let you know I'm going to have a couple red lines as I invoke some methods that don't yet exist. I have a bit more work to do, but for now, remember where we left off. We're on line number 92, which is the action performed for that search button. So what I need to do next is wire up the inventory reader to this form. Now, the inventory reader is a class with essentially static methods that's just going out, getting that file, reading it in, creating vehicle objects out of it. So since it's static, I don't need to create an object out of it. However, I do need to make one change to the inventory reader. If we take a look, we see the static methods, but we notice that createVehicle is private. Let's go ahead and make that public so that we can invoke that from our driver form. And, you know, if you didn't see a previous video, I made this inventory reader in a previous video. It simply opens the file called inventory.txt, and then it reads into vehicles like so. So a bit of work that we already have here. Now, let's go up towards the top of our form. And here in the constructor, I'll say inventory reader dot create vehicles. Now notice that returns void. So we just have to invoke this, and then we trust it's going to open that file, read the file, and read the vehicle objects it creates into a collection, which we can access later, because remember, we're going to turn this into a hash map. But nonetheless, we're kicking off that process in the constructor, so it's going to be reading from that file as this form is loading up. Now, let's go back to that button that we created earlier, and I'm going to say inventory reader, fetch. I'll say fetch vehicle, and I'll pass in this VIN. Now we know that fetch vehicle method does not yet exist in inventory reader, but the good thing is our IDE can help us out here because it's given us a red line which says something is wrong and let me help you fix it. So I right click, or I alt enter, and I say create method fetch vehicle, and you see it creates it with a proper signature, public static void fetch vehicle. Probably a good idea to put a bit of JavaDoc over here. As a matter of fact, you know what? I'm going to change that return type. Instead of returning void, it should return a vehicle. So you see I have a bit of JavaDoc above here, and we know we still have to implement this. I hate doing return null even temporarily, but we have a to-do there, so we'll remember to come pick this up in a little bit. Now, That's going to fetch the vehicle. The next thing that we want to do is populate the vehicle into the Swing form so that the user can see the vehicle details and edit the vehicle details. I need to do just a bit of refactoring here because you see I've created this as a local variable, which means it's only alive within this very small method. I'm going to promote it to be an attribute of this class. Now, I also have created a shadow condition because if you take a look at line 40 through about line 71, we have another button action listener, and it's this save button here. Up until this point, we've assumed that we're always creating a new vehicle. In this case, we are assuming that we could be updating an existing vehicle or creating new. So I have to make a little change to that save function to account for creating new versus updating existing. So a couple things. First of all, when I do this lookup that we were just doing, I need to set a flag to say this is an existing vehicle. So I'll make a new Boolean. We'll assume it's not an existing vehicle. In other words, it's a new vehicle unless we know better. So I initialize it to false. Now down here in the action performed for the VIN lookup, an emphasis on lookup, that means reading an existing vehicle. We're going to flip that existing vehicle flag to true. And now we have to do a little bit more on this action perform that we see here on line 42, which remember again is the save button that we see right here. So notice line number 53, I'm creating a new vehicle because up to this point we've always assumed that we are creating a new vehicle. I've also introduced a shadow condition. Be very cautious of shadow conditions. A shadow condition is when you have a variable with the same name in two different scopes. So I have an attribute name vehicle, which means it has visibility through all the methods of this class, but I also have a local variable name vehicle, and that can get very dangerous. But you know what? I really could just consolidate all of that into one attribute. I don't necessarily need a separate local variable now. And that's easy enough to do, because if we have type and then name, we're declaring a variable. But if we just have name, we're simply referencing an existing variable. So at this point, I'm still creating a new vehicle object here, but I'm reusing that existing vehicle variable I've created before. But remember, we also don't want to create a new object all the time. We don't want to create a new object if we are editing an existing vehicle. So let me wrap this in an if test. Say not existing vehicle. So if it's not an existing vehicle, it's going to be a new vehicle. And then we simply reassign the object that's stored in that vehicle variable to a new vehicle object. On the other hand, if it is an existing vehicle, well, we don't need to reassign that variable. As a matter of fact, we don't want to reassign that variable because on line 100, we are already assigning the existing vehicle to that vehicle variable here. So just careful there. Existing vehicle is already going to be in the vehicle variable. New vehicle, we're going to run through this if test and we're going to create a new vehicle object and store it into that variable. Either way, by the time we get to line 57, we will have an existing vehicle. So I put a comment up here so that we realize what's going on here. We're only creating a new vehicle if we need to. Otherwise, we update the existing vehicle. One more thing we need to do while we're in here. Actually, a few more things. But one is, each time we press save, we want to clear the canvas and start all over again. So I'm going to reset that existing vehicle flag to false on save. And I'm also going to empty out all the fields, just clear them out for the next vehicle, which really I should have done a while ago. But nonetheless, we'll go ahead and take care of that now. Existing vehicle is false, and then I'm just making a new function called clear fields to kind of keep this a little more succinct because this method's starting to go a little bit long. Okay, so that works for our clear form. I'm going to make I'm just going to borrow this because I want to have something similar in the lookup form, except in the lookup form, once the user searched a vehicle, I want to populate this form with those values. So it's going to be a similar set of method calls, but instead of passing in an empty string, I'm going to be passing in actual vehicle values. Notice I used a little cheat on the numerical values because setText is looking for a string and a double or an int is not a string. There are a couple ways we could do it to convert an int or a double to a string. One quick way to do it is simply to do string concatenation, which is where we start with a string, which in this case is empty string. And then we use the plus operator, which is overloaded in this case when there's a string on one side. Java will automatically convert what's on the other side to a string as well. Now, and then return the entire string. One thing we need to be careful of that I'm kind of ignoring here is what if these values are not populated? Actually, that's not so bad because the default value for a double or an int is essentially 0. So it'll just come back as 0, but that's something that's a good idea to check for. All this being said, I think we're in pretty good shape. We still need to add the hash map, which as I said I'll do in a later video. But let's take a look and see how the form works now. I start the program in debugger mode, and we notice when it starts this constructor, it goes into inventory reader create vehicle. So notice as I step into, it goes in and it's reading all these vehicles. Now, because we're reading a file, we should really do this in a separate thread because we're calling it from the user interface thread. But, just note to self, not something I'm worried about right now, but note to self in a production application, we would want to put any kind of networking or file I/O in a separate thread. We go ahead and continue, and the form comes up. And now Vin, we know search is not going to work just yet, but we can see we can type in a Vin and hit search, and not a whole lot's going to happen from that. But nonetheless, I've actually just set the flag to say we're using an existing vehicle. So I'm going to go ahead and start this over again until we completely implement that so that I can just demonstrate creating a new vehicle and then clearing out those fields once we hit the save button. So we'll start with the Sonic. We'll say odometer 10,000, miles per gallon 15, gallons of gas 10. Description, a beautiful economical car, something of that nature. And now I'm going to choose save. When I choose save, notice we have this test, is it an existing vehicle? Well, this time around, I didn't do a lookup, so existing vehicle is false. Now remember, we have the negation operator here, or the exclamation, which means make a false true or make a true false. So in this case, existing vehicle is false, but the negation operator turns this if test to true, which means that this if test is going to execute its body. And just as we've done before, we're going to call our factory method to create a new vehicle. And sure enough, when we take a look after the if test, we see that we have a new vehicle of type Sonic, and right now we've not yet initialized the data we got from the form, so it just starts with some default data, and we go ahead and step through and create our vehicle. And after we walk through these steps of gathering data from the form, we can see that our vehicle now is populated with some actual data. So the data we put in, 15 miles per gallon, 10 gallons of gas, 10,000 on the odometer. We'll go ahead and let this proceed. Now, the next thing you'll see, which is kind of funny, and I kind of stepped over that a bit quickly, but you notice that indeed it did clear the fields out after we hit save, so now we're ready to start with our next vehicle. But on the same note, you notice that it put the vehicle in the J list as we did in a previous video. So it did indeed create that vehicle, and of course if I want to drive it 100 miles, we'll see the odometer and the gallons of gas change. Odometer 10,100, gallons of gas went from 10 to 4. So our existing functionality that we created before still works fine. So that will wrap us up for this preparation video. In the next video now, because we've done this prep work, we can be laser focused on how to store our vehicles in a hash map when they're read from a file. And then when we do a Venn lookup, we can bring one of those vehicles from our hash map right into our user interface form, and then we can do operations on it. So I hope this video was helpful prep for that. I think you're going to like the next video. So as always, I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you.